Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Ashford had called her the moment she walked into the morning briefing 3 weeks ago. Not by name. Never by name. Just a nurse, as though the title itself explained why her observations on trauma protocols could be safely dismissed, why her recommendations for medication adjustments required his explicit approval despite her clinical assessments being measurably more accurate than his. They didn't know. None of them in this Atlanta hospital knew that Captain Ashley Cooper, United States Navy, had held a trauma bay alone for 6 consecutive hours under direct enemy fire in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, that she had kept 19 SEALs breathing when their supply lines were cut, that the steady hands they saw moving through patient care had performed emergency procedures in sandstorm darkness with bullets striking concrete 3 feet from her position. She was invisible here, and invisible was exactly how she needed to stay. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their familiar surgical frequency as Ashley pulled on scrubs 2 sizes too large, the fabric hanging loose against her frame in a way she cultivated deliberately. Invisibility required unremarkability. Her dark hair was pulled back in a standard bun. No jewelry except a watch with a cracked face she'd bought at a pawn shop on Peachtree Street for $14. She wore compression socks under uniform shoes scuffed to a matte finish. The battered thermos in her locker, faded navy insignia barely visible, turned inward where no one would see it, held black coffee she'd made at 4:30 in the morning in her Arlington apartment, 2 hours before the 5-hour drive to Atlanta. The thermos was the only thing she carried that connected to who she actually was. Everything else was scaffolding. Everything else was the cover NCIS had built for her when they'd pulled her from medical discharge 6 months ago and asked her to do something that required becoming someone else. The shift began at 6:45 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. Ashley arrived at 5:58, early enough to avoid conversation, early enough to review the charts before the day nurses arrived and the unit dissolved into the controlled chaos she'd grown to recognize as typical. Riverside Community Hospital ran 3 trauma bays, 2 surgical suites, and a 12-bed intensive care unit where most of the critical cases landed. She'd been assigned to ICU rotation for 3 weeks, long enough to establish credibility with the staff, short enough that her competence hadn't yet become threatening to the administrators. In her previous assignment at St. Jude's Memorial in Chicago, she'd lasted for weeks before getting reassigned. In San Diego at Mount Sinai Grace, 6 weeks before a staffing restructure moved her to night shift where no one noticed her work. The pattern was predictable. Competence that couldn't be explained away made people uncomfortable. People didn't like questions about their own judgment when someone else's judgment was demonstrably better. The first chart she reviewed belonged to Mr. Harrison in bed 3, 72 years old, admitted at 2 a.m. with acute MI. Troponin levels were still climbing despite the heparin drip and dual antiplatelet therapy he'd been receiving for 14 hours. Ashley's eyes moved across the vitals with the practiced efficiency of someone reading text in her native language, blood pressure stable at 122/71, oxygen saturation 97% on 2 liters, heart rate elevated at 94. His current medication orders showed a standard post-MI protocol, appropriate but not optimized. She made a note, one of the documentation forms she'd submit to Dr. Ashford later, the recommendations he would review and either ignore or take credit for if they helped the patient recover. This was part of her cover. A nurse who suggested nothing was suspicious. A nurse who occasionally made observations was thorough. A nurse who made too many observations was ambitious and therefore threatening. But the chart she'd been waiting for sat at the end of the row, in room 340, and when Ashley pulled it, her hands remained perfectly steady as she read the admission details. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen, age 27, admitted with blunt force chest trauma secondary to motor vehicle accident, lacerations on left anterior chest wall, currently stable on standard trauma protocol, pain management controlled, scheduled for CT imaging at 8 a.m. Her eye scanned the vital signs, looking for the clinical picture, but what she was actually looking for was in his belongings, documented in the property list attached to the admission packet, one field journal, personal effects, currently secured in the patient safe. She knew exactly what was in that journal. She'd given it to him herself, 18 months ago, in a desert compound 200 miles north of Sangin, the morning before she was medically evacuated with shrapnel wounds to her left arm and a recommendation for discharge. The journal had pressed flowers in it, ones they'd found growing against impossible odds near the perimeter of FOB Shank. She'd written his name on the first page in her handwriting. And between those pages, in cipher, were the identifiers of every supply shipment that had gone missing in the 6 months before her evacuation, every supply unit that had been diverted before reaching the forward operating base, every gap in inventory that didn't match the paperwork. Marcus had kept that journal. Marcus had coded additional intelligence into it after she left. Marcus had somehow survived the IED blast that should have killed him, the blast that had happened while he was performing the exact trauma intervention she'd taught him, and now he was lying in room 340 of a hospital in Atlanta, and no one here knew that she'd trained him, that she'd held him under fire, that she'd left him behind to be replaced in a position that nearly killed him. What happened next didn't just change the morning. It began the real reason she was here. The morning rounds began at 7:15 a.m., and Dr. Ashford arrived precisely on time, as he always did, with 2 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish behind a shark. He was a man whose authority came entirely from the uniform of his title. 54 years old, inherited wealth evident in the Swiss watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe worth $8,000 that he rotated through a collection of 3 identical watches so he could wear one while the others were serviced, a detail Ashley had noticed during her first week, inherited credibility from his family name, Ashford, which appeared on a building in the hospital's donor section. His voice carried the flat inflection of someone accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. "Room 1, Mr. Harrison," Dr. Ashford announced, and the procession moved down the corridor. Ashley followed at the rear, the position that required the least acknowledgement, the place where she could observe without being observed observing. Dr. Ashford reviewed the chart with the clinical thoroughness of someone who'd trained in emergency medicine before his family's wealth had transformed his career trajectory into something more administrative than practical. He asked appropriate questions. The residents answered. The attending physician, himself, considered the data and made decisions that were reasonable, competent, and insufficient. Continue current therapy, Dr. Ashford decided. We'll repeat labs at 10 a.m. Let's move on. Ashley's throat felt the familiar tightness of clinical disagreement suppressed. The troponin trajectory suggested something more aggressive would be warranted, possibly a second-line agent, possibly a review of the timing on his second antiplatelet load. But this wasn't her assessment to offer. Not yet. Not visibly. She waited instead until rounds were complete, until the attending physician and his residents had moved back to the nurse's station, and then she approached the desk where one of the residents stood updating the central monitoring system. "Dr. Chen," she said quietly, addressing the junior resident by name, using the formal address that marked her as deferential. Did Dr. Ashford seem concerned about Mr. Harrison's troponin trajectory? The resident, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the petty officer in room 340, though the universe had a cruel sense of humor about coincidences, looked up from her screen with the mild puzzlement of someone asked a question by a subordinate who usually asked nothing. "I mean, it's still rising, but within expected parameters for post-MI. Why?" "Just wondering if you'd thought about escalation," Ashley said, keeping her voice at exactly the register that communicated uncertainty rather than assertion. His current protocol is standard, but his individual response pattern suggests he might benefit from more aggressive management. Just a thought. Dr. Chen made a note. Not a commitment. Possibly nothing. But the observation was now in the system, floating in the space between Ashley's documentation and Dr. Ashford's pride. If Mr. Harrison's condition worsened, the thought would be remembered. If he recovered, Dr. Ashford's standard protocol would be credited. Ashley had learned to exist in these small margins, the spaces where good outcomes could be attributed to the system rather than to any individual person's clinical brilliance. The clock on the ICU wall showed 7:54 a.m. In exactly 4 hours, Marcus Chen would go downstairs for his scheduled CT imaging. In exactly 4 hours and 20 minutes, while he was on that imaging table, she would have access to his room, to his property box, to the field journal that NCIS needed her to photograph and document. The supply diversion operation that had left her SEAL teams under-equipped, that had left Marcus's position unstaffed long enough for the IED to be placed, that had nearly killed him in the exact way it should have killed someone less skilled, that operation had a paper trail. And that paper trail led directly to Dr. Ashford, who had been using the hospital's position as a major medical supplier to regional military contractors to funnel surgical supplies to black market contacts in Afghanistan at a profit margin that had made him approximately $740,000 in the past 2 years. The federal investigation had been running for 14 months. Ashley's position here had been running for 23 days. And in the next 4 hours and 20 minutes, everything depended on her maintaining the appearance of being just a nurse while performing the actions of a naval intelligence operative. She'd done harder things. She'd performed an emergency cricothyrotomy under fire with the patient losing consciousness mid-procedure, had controlled hemorrhage from a femoral artery bleed with nothing but field equipment and her own hands, had kept people alive in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. But those situations had allowed her to be exactly who she was. This situation required her to be someone else entirely. The task ahead of her, retrieving the journal, documenting the evidence, ensuring Marcus's safety while the investigation collapsed the supply chain around her, was actually simpler than maintaining invisibility. Simpler than walking past Dr. Ashford every morning and saying nothing while he dismissed her with casual cruelty. Simpler than standing in this ICU with a weight of 19 SEAL team personnel survival hanging on her ability to act without appearing to be acting, all while the man responsible for their under-equipment walked freely through these corridors in his $8,000 watch, completely unaware that the woman he'd called just a nurse was about to end his career. She returned to the med cart and resumed her rounds, hands moving with practiced precision through the standard assessments, checking full lines and medication administration, updating charts with the small observations that marked her as thorough without being visible. The machines around her hummed their electronic frequency, ventilators breathing for patients whose bodies had temporarily forgotten how. The morning light came through the windows in clean rectangles, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. And Ashley Cooper, Captain, United States Navy, retired, officially deceased under one name and officially living under another, waited for the clock to reach 11:15 a.m. with the patience of someone who had already survived worse waiting in far more dangerous places. What she didn't know yet was that her presence here had already been observed. That Dr. Ashford, in his own way, was beginning to realize that the woman he dismissed as unremarkable was becoming the exact opposite. The morning rounds began like every other morning at Riverside Community, fluorescent lights humming their fluorescent hum, machines beeping their rhythmic patterns, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air like a chemical fog. Ashley stood in room 340 with her tablet, reviewing Marcus Chen's cardiac readings from the previous night. His rhythm had stabilized. His oxygen saturation was climbing. Everything she'd ordered was working precisely as she'd calculated it would. Dr. Ashford pushed through the door at 7:43 a.m. with his entourage trailing behind him like a royal court, 2 residents, 1 medical student, and the patient's sister standing near the window with her hands clasped tight. "Nurse Cooper." His voice carried the tone of someone who'd practiced condescension so long it became his default frequency. "I'm curious about this cardiac monitoring protocol you've implemented." Ashley continued her assessment, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd performed these movements 10,000 times. Continuous telemetry with modified lead placement. His injury pattern indicates. Even a first-year resident knows that approach is contraindicated for his presentation. Ashford positioned himself between Ashley and the bed, his body language deliberate, territorial. The medical student watched with the hunger of someone learning exactly how to dismantle a colleague. His ejection fraction doesn't support that level of monitoring intensity. Ashley set down her tablet. Took one measured breath. The room seemed to tighten around her, Marcus watching from the bed, his sister leaning forward, the residents exchanging glances. She'd trained young Navy SEALs to move through hostile territory. She'd held a trauma bay together for 6 hours under direct fire with shrapnel embedding itself in the concrete walls behind her. She'd taught Marcus himself the exact procedures she was now being interrogated about, standing in the same Sangin dust where everything had changed. The protocol accounts for his specific injury pattern, which the standard approach misses. Her voice dropped an octave without her trying. It simply happened, the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Ashford's face reddened like something filling with pressure. "I think I'll be the judge of what approach to take with MY patients, Nightingale." The nickname landed precisely where he intended it to land, a diminishment, a mockery, a public reminder that she was subordinate. She was disposable. She was just a nurse. Marcus's sister flinched. One of the residents looked at his shoes. Ashley met Ashford's eyes without blinking, without the tremor that he was clearly waiting for, and simply said, "I'll let the patient's recovery speak to whose judgment should be questioned here." She turned back to her charting. Didn't give him the audience he'd engineered. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind, it was the silence of a man realizing he hadn't broken what he'd expected to break, and that realization sat across his features like a crack in porcelain. Ashford left for minutes later, his entourage filing behind him like disciples following a false prophet. That afternoon, Ashley pushed open the break room door at 2:17 p.m. with her lunch, turkey sandwich on wheat, apple, black coffee in the ceramic mug Marcus had given her 3 years ago at a deployment ceremony, before everything went wrong in the Jolin district and before he took that IED blast meant for someone else. The usual table was occupied. Nurses gathered their things. Within 20 seconds, the entire table had relocated to the far corner of the room, leaving behind only the scrape of chair legs against linoleum and a silence so thick the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder in compensation. Ashley sat alone. Watched the steam rise from her coffee. Didn't eat. Didn't open her phone. Just sat with her hands folded on the table and understood that Ashford had moved from humiliation to strategic dismantling. He was separating her from the herd. Wolves operated this way. Predators moved this way. And she'd survived worse than office politics, but sitting there watching trained medical professionals suddenly forget she existed, she understood that he wasn't done. This was an opening move. Thursday morning arrived grey and cold, rain hammering the hospital windows like someone demanding entry. Ashley was passing the unit board at 6:52 a.m. when she saw it, a formal written reprimand printed on official letterhead and posted where all staff would see it. Ashford stood 3 feet away, pretending to review the schedule board but watching her with the intensity of a surgeon observing his incision. He wanted to see her break. Wanted to witness the collapse he'd engineered. One tear escaped before Ashley could stop it, not from fear, not from humiliation, but from pure frustration at the waste of it, the absurdity of standing here fighting office politics when there were supply manifests in the basement that proved Ashford had been diverting morphine shipments, when there were Navy SEALs somewhere in a mountain range without proper medical equipment because of his black market sales, when Marcus Chen was upstairs recovering from an injury that shouldn't have happened if proper supplies had been available in Sangin. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. Looked directly at Ashford and said, "Interesting that you need an audience for paperwork." Her voice was perfectly level. Perfectly controlled. The kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst the world could offer. Ashford's jaw tightened. He'd expected something different, tears, anger, defensive explanations. Instead he'd gotten a woman who looked at his reprimand the way a general might regard a child's tantrum, and that inability to provoke her seemed to infuriate him more than any confrontation could have. Staff members began gathering at the board throughout the morning, reading the notice, whispered commentary following in her wake. By noon, 3 critical patients had been reassigned to other nurses. By 2 p.m., Ashley had been moved to post-op recovery, the least demanding assignment, the kind of work they'd hand to someone with limitations. Each patient she'd been managing was transferred to less experienced staff, a calculated message that she wasn't trusted with complexity. That evening, at 2 a.m., with the hospital in that strange suspended silence between night shift and dawn, Ashley sat alone in a medication supply room reviewing inventory logs on her tablet. The screen cast her face in blue light as she scrolled through morphine dispensing records, surgical supply manifests, pharmaceutical deliveries. NCIS had placed her here specifically to track this, the supplies going missing, the patterns matching black market distribution networks in Afghanistan, the exact supplies that had left her teams under-equipped in Sangin where Marcus had taken shrapnel meant for someone else. She photographed discrepancies. Cross-referenced dates with Ashford's rotation schedule. The pattern was undeniable, every significant supply diversion occurred during his shifts, his signatures approving inventory adjustments that were technically correct but collectively pointed towards systematic theft at a scale that suggested either conspiracy or criminal negligence. In the parking garage at 2:47 a.m., rain drumming against concrete, Ashley sat in her car and uploaded encrypted files to her NCIS handler. Her message was precise: supply diversions confirmed. Timeline established. Ashford on duty for 97% of discrepancies. Need final documentation. Target has field intelligence. Window closing. The response came back in 40 seconds. Retrieve the journal. Maintain cover. Mission timeline critical. Chen transfer is preventive measure. Retrieve and exfil. Ashley stared at that message. Exfiltrate. As if she wasn't a nurse in Atlanta. As if she was still someone who operated in the dark with extraction protocols and radio frequencies. As if the identity she'd been building at Riverside Community, the careful invisible woman who asked no questions and caused no trouble, was just another cover waiting to be dropped. The next morning, Dr. Ashford announced the transfer during rounds with the kind of administrative cheerfulness that masked something else entirely. Petty Officer Chen is being moved to the VA facility in Birmingham. Excellent specialized care. Better suited to his needs. Transfer occurs in 48 hours. 48 hours. 2 days. The timeline tightened until it felt like something physical pressing against her chest. That afternoon, Ashley entered Marcus's room with her vital sign monitor and her carefully constructed invisibility, and Marcus was holding the journal. The leather-bound field journal with pressed desert flowers between its pages. The same one she'd given him before Sangin, before everything changed, before he'd become the medic who replaced her and suffered for it. He looked at her with sudden terrible clarity. "You're Captain Cooper." "The captain. I know your face from the photos they showed us. Before we deployed." Ashley's cover cracked, not visibly, not audibly, but internally, in some chamber of her chest that hadn't been breached in 4 years. She recovered in the space of a breath, in the time it took her hand to complete checking his oxygen saturation levels. "You're confused from the medications, Marcus. Rest now." But he shook his head, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd suddenly recognized a legend standing in front of him wearing scrubs and a hospital badge. "The procedures you perform, nobody here does them like you taught us to do them." The medication supply room hummed with the quiet of empty hallways and fluorescent lights that never dimmed. Ashley sat alone at 11:47 p.m., her tablet casting a pale glow across her face as she cross-referenced inventory logs against the roster schedule taped to the wall. Morphine. Fentanyl patches. Surgical-grade epinephrine. All of it tracked, all of it accounted for in the official ledgers that Riverside Community Hospital submitted to the state every month. Except it wasn't. She pulled up the batch numbers from the past 18 months and started a new timeline. Missing, 47 vials of concentrated morphine on March 14, Dr. Ashford on duty. Missing, 23 fentanyl patches on April 2. Dr. Ashford on duty. Missing, 89 units of post-operative antibiotics on May 8, Dr. Ashford, again. The pattern emerged like a constellation, invisible until you knew where to look, and then impossible to unsee. Ashley's fingers moved across the tablet screen, pulling up the field journal documentation she'd photographed in Marcus's room 3 days ago, before everything collapsed. The coded intelligence entries aligned with the supply dates like a key turning in a lock. Contact network active Kandahar province, the 15th of May. Supply diversion the 16th of May. Secondary distribution point established Jalabad region, the 4th of June. Missing antibiotics the 3rd of June. The journal wasn't just evidence of theft. It was a map of how American medical supplies meant for forward operating bases were being diverted to black market contacts in Afghanistan, how operators in the field were running low on critical medications, how teams were being left under-equipped because someone at Riverside Community Hospital was selling their lifelines to the highest bidder. That someone was Dr. Ashford. The room felt colder. Ashley set the tablet down on the laminate counter and let her hands rest flat against the cold surface. 18 months. How many operators had been affected? How many field medics had improvised because the supplies they needed were already overseas in hostile hands? The math didn't require calculation. It required only the weight of what she already knew. The supply room door opened at 12:03 a.m. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway, his white coat pristine, his expression arranged into something that resembled concerned authority. He carried a folder, thick, official, the color of institutional power. Behind him, Ashley caught movement in the corridor beyond. Two figures. HR representatives, she recognized immediately from their badges and their careful positioning, witnesses, documentation, the machinery of institutional destruction beginning to turn. Captain, he paused, as if catching himself. Miss Cooper. We need to talk about your actions in the trauma bay. Ashley rose slowly from the chair, tablet still dark in her hand. She didn't respond. She knew this dance. She'd seen it executed by officers trying to reorganize command structure. By district attorneys building cases. By adversaries who understood that paperwork could be as lethal as any blade if you used it correctly. I've reviewed the incident from earlier this evening, Dr. Ashford continued, moving further into the room. His voice carried the measured cadence of a man reading from a prepared script. The emergency pericardiocentesis you performed on Mr. Chen without attending physician authorization. Without consultation. Without so much as a page to my office. He was in cardiac tamponade. Ashley's voice was flat. Statement of fact. No justification attached. Hospital Protocol Section 1.2.4.7 requires advance authorization for any invasive procedure beyond basic nursing scope. That's in your employment contract. Page 4. He opened the folder, sliding it across the counter toward her. I've also compiled your entire tenure here. This incident isn't isolated. I see a pattern of independent decision-making, a consistent disregard for chain of command. 2 years of insubordination, documented. Ashley looked at the papers spread across the counter without touching them. She could read the headers from where she stood: incident report, unauthorized medical procedure. Peer review findings, pattern of conduct. Incident documentation, the 24th of June, emergency pericardiocentesis, patient room 340. The documentation was meticulous. Times. Dates. Video timestamps. She understood what she was looking at, not an investigation, but a case being built. Dr. Ashford had spent the last 8 hours constructing a termination file so comprehensive that HR would have no choice but to execute it. But he didn't stop there. I've also reviewed the surveillance footage from your actions in Mr. Chen's room, Dr. Ashford said, his voice taking on a harder edge. 7 separate instances over the past 48 hours where you've attempted to access his chart outside your assigned duties. 3 instances where you attempted to enter his room after Dr. Patel specifically reassigned his care to another provider. The air in the medication supply room seemed to contract. Ashley understood immediately what had happened. Dr. Ashford wasn't just protecting his reputation anymore. He was protecting the journal. He'd seen her attempts to retrieve it. He'd already been in Marcus's room searching for the same evidence she needed. The realization moved through her like electrical current. He knew. Not everything, maybe, but enough. Enough to understand that Marcus Chen represented a threat. Effective immediately, you're restricted from all contact with patient Chen, Dr. Ashford continued. I've posted a note in his chart prohibiting your access. Security has been notified. Any attempt to violate this restriction will result in immediate disciplinary action up to and including termination. One of the HR representatives stepped forward. A woman with grey hair and eyes that had seen this executed before. She held out a document. This is written notice of the restriction. You're required to sign it. Ashley didn't take it. She looked at Dr. Ashford directly for the first time since the conversation began. You're afraid of him. I'm protecting patient safety, Dr. Ashford said. His voice remained level, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something that looked like recognition. Like awareness that she understood the architecture of what he was building. You're protecting something else, Ashley said quietly. You're protecting the thing he has. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. It was a silence so thick you could hear the medication refrigerator humming behind them, could hear the distant rhythm of a monitor beeping in a patient room down the corridor, could hear the sound of Dr. Ashford's breathing change, faster now, less controlled. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But he did. And that meant the timeline was accelerating. That meant she had hours, not days, before Dr. Ashford either destroyed the journal or secured it somewhere she couldn't reach it. That meant the entire operation was collapsing in real time. Ashley took the document from the HR representative's hand and signed it without reading it. There was no point in refusing. The refusal would only give Dr. Ashford additional ammunition. The document was theatre, evidence that she'd been duly notified, that her actions afterward would be insubordination, that the paper trail continued to accumulate with bureaucratic precision. "You're done here," Dr. Ashford said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind of command that comes from someone who understood the mechanics of institutional power. "You'll complete your shift tonight, but I've reassigned all of your patients. You're on observation status pending the formal peer review hearing, which will occur in 48 hours. Until that hearing, you perform no patient care. You log all communications with staff. You come in, you sit in the break room, and you wait." Ashley nodded once. She set the signed document on the counter and watched Dr. Ashford gather the rest of the papers, watched him tuck them back into the folder with the careful precision of someone filing evidence. The two HR representatives withdrew first, moving back into the corridor. Dr. Ashford followed, pausing at the door. "I'd strongly suggest you contact an employment attorney," he said. "Not that it will help. But it's the professional courtesy I extend to people about to lose their jobs." He closed the door behind him, leaving Ashley alone with the refrigerator's hum and the understanding that she'd just watched a man execute the bureaucratic equivalent of a surgical strike. Every procedure clean. Every document prepared. Every witness present. Every detail recorded. She stood motionless for another moment, then pulled out her phone. The NCIS handler would be sleeping. The message would wake them at 12:15 a.m., which was the point. The FBI timeline was accelerating. The supplies had already moved to secondary markets. The black market network was already activating distribution protocols. Without the journal, without Marcus's coded intelligence linking each supply diversion to specific contact names and locations in Kandahar and Jalabad, the arrests would be incomplete. The operation would survive in reduced form. The supplies would keep flowing. But worse, Dr. Ashford would walk free. She typed the message in the fluorescent silence: "Target is aware. Journal is compromised. Recommend immediate extraction." The phone showed message sent at 12:16 a.m. What Ashley didn't know was that her message had triggered a classification review 340 miles north at NCIS headquarters in Washington, D.C. What she didn't know was that the FBI had been building a parallel investigation for 11 months. What she didn't know was that Petty Officer Marcus Chen wasn't sleeping. He was watching her name appear in hospital surveillance logs, understanding now why Captain Ashley Cooper had been so calm when she'd performed the procedure that saved his life, understanding that the woman he'd recognized in the medication supply room 2 days ago was the same operator who'd trained him in Sangin, the same medic who'd given him the journal before her reassignment, the same officer who'd taught him to question authority when authority failed the mission. And what Dr. Ashford didn't know, as he walked back to his office at 12:17 a.m. and locked the door behind him, was that he'd just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He'd assumed the greatest threat was Ashley's hands that could perform emergency procedures in hostile darkness. He'd failed to understand that Ashley's true weapon was her silence. Her patience. Her ability to maintain cover until the moment it no longer mattered. Her willingness to let him construct his own case so thoroughly that when the truth emerged, there would be no argument about the magnitude of what he'd done. The hospital settled into its 2 a.m. rhythm. The ICU hummed. The ER held its vigil. The night shift continued its work in the spaces between consciousness and crisis. And in room 340, Marcus Chen lay awake, the field journal hidden now, its secrets already transmitted to people who understood their value, its pressed desert flowers, flowers Ashley had given him in Sangin 3 years ago, still protected between pages of coded intelligence that had just become a death sentence for someone's military career. The cardiac monitor erupted at 3:47 a.m. 3 short beeps that cut through the darkness of room 340 like scissors through silk. Then continuous alarms, the sound of a heart betraying its owner, collapsing inward under pressure it couldn't sustain. Ashley was 3 rooms away, charting vitals for a post-op patient, when the noise registered not as sound but as information: acute decompensation, cardiac tamponade. Marcus Chen was dying behind closed doors. She moved before her conscious mind caught up. The hallway tiles were cold under her feet, her scrub bottoms whispering against her legs as she accelerated. The security guard stationed outside room 340, the one Dr. Ashford had positioned there specifically to prevent her access, barely had time to register her approach before she shouldered past him. Not aggressively. Efficiently. The way you move when hesitation costs lives. Marcus lay grey against white pillows, his chest rising in shallow gasps. His oxygen saturation was 74% and dropping. His blood pressure, when she glanced at the monitor, read 64/38. The resident on call stood frozen beside the bed, hands hovering uselessly in the air like he was trying to catch smoke. "We need to call the attending," the resident whispered. "Protocol requires." 3 minutes, Ashley said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't a nurse's voice anymore. It was the voice of someone who had held trauma bays open with her own hands while rounds exploded against metal containers. "If we wait 3 minutes, he's dead." She was already moving, one hand reaching for the ultrasound probe, the other drawing up the pericardiocentesis kit with movements that flowed together like water finding its own path downhill. The resident stepped back. He understood, finally, that he was watching someone operate at a different altitude than he occupied. The ultrasound came alive in her hands. Black screen to grey to confirmation, fluid surrounding Marcus's heart like he was drowning from the inside. A pericardial effusion large enough to compress the ventricle, large enough to kill him in the time it took to dial an attending physician. Ashley prepped the area with antiseptic that smelled like copper and alcohol. The needle, 14-gauge angiocath, sterile, precisely the instrument she'd inserted under sandstorm conditions with rounds snapping past her head, went into her hands like muscle memory taking over. She positioned it at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, between his ribs where she'd learned to look for the tiny window between bone and vital organs. Marcus's eyes found hers. Wide. Understanding. The last conscious moment before she advanced the needle. She felt the tissue layers part, skin, fascia, muscle, then the sudden give as the needle entered the pericardial space. Dark blood flowed backward into the syringe, thick and wrong-colored, the fluid that was choking his heart. Decompression. Immediate. The monitor's alarms changed their tone, frantic to urgent to almost normal. His oxygen saturation climbed, 74, 81, 88, 92. His pulse strengthened. Color flooded back into his face like someone had turned a dimmer switch. Sinus rhythm, the resident breathed. Ashley documented the procedure with clinical precision, each notation a fact, each timestamp a record. She knew what was coming. You don't perform an unauthorized invasive procedure in an American hospital without consequences. She'd understood that from the moment Marcus crashed. She'd weighed the choice, protocol or survival. She'd chosen survival. Dr. Ashford arrived 20 minutes later. He stepped into room 340 like someone entering a crime scene, his eyes sweeping across the monitors, the stable vital signs, Marcus breathing normally now, color normal, heart rhythm steady. His face went stone cold. The kind of cold that comes from understanding you've lost control of the narrative you'd so carefully constructed. Within an hour, she was sitting in his office. The office with the mahogany desk and the eager wall of credentials. HR sat to her left, a woman named Patricia whose trembling hands told Ashley she'd been pressured to attend. Dr. Ashford slid a termination letter across the desk as if it was a sacrament. "Gross violation of protocol," he read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd spent weeks sharpening against her. "Unauthorized invasive procedure. Endangerment of patient safety. He looked at her over his glasses. You're terminated, effective immediately. Ashley picked up the letter. 3 pages. Single-spaced. The incident report referenced exact hospital policy numbers, 17.4.3, subsection B, the specific regulation he'd been waiting to weaponize. There were timestamps. There was surveillance footage. There was documentation of a peer review committee he'd convened yesterday, before Marcus even crashed, already preparing the framework for her destruction. He'd built her firing before the emergency happened. Her life-saving intervention had simply handed him the justification he needed. Security will escort you from the building, Dr. Ashford said. He didn't look satisfied. He looked relieved. Like a man who'd finally been permitted to stop pretending. Ashley turned in her badge without speaking. The laminated rectangle with her photo, the composure in her eyes, the neutral expression, went onto his desk. She'd never really been a nurse. She'd been pretending. And now the pretense was over. The lobby was quiet at 5:15 a.m. The night staff moving between stations with the efficiency of people who'd learned not to notice things. As security walked her toward the exit, Marcus Chen appeared in the hallway in a wheelchair, still wearing the hospital gown, and for still running. His voice was weak but audible. She saved my life. Dr. Ashford walked past without turning around. The message was clear: the life of one patient meant nothing against the preservation of institutional authority. The parking garage was a cathedral of concrete and fluorescent strips. Ashley's car sat 3 rows back, a grey Toyota with diplomatic plates she kept for travel emergencies. She sat in the driver's seat with the door closed, hands on the steering wheel, engine dead. 30 minutes passed. An hour. She couldn't move because moving meant accepting failure, and failure meant operators still in Sangin remained under-equipped. Failure meant Ashford kept stealing supplies that cost lives. Failure meant the mission was over and she'd learned nothing about where the intelligence went after it left his desk. Her phone showed 17 missed messages from her NCIS handler. She couldn't answer them. A tap on the window. Ethan stood there in the dim light, 17 years old, backpack in hand, his face set with the stubborn determination she recognized from her own reflection. He'd followed her. He must have overheard something at home, understood something about the shadow box he'd found in the basement. "Mom," he said through the glass. "They need to see these." He was holding it, the shadow box with its weighted interior, its careful arrangement of metal and ribbon. The Navy Cross gleaming like it held all the light the basement had stolen from it. The bronze star with its 3 Vela devices. The purple hearts, 2 of them, each one representing a moment when her body had paid for her decisions. "Ethan, no," Ashley said, but he was already walking toward the hospital entrance. She moved without thinking, following him through the automatic doors into the lobby where the night shift was changing, nurses heading home, day staff arriving for the morning rounds. Ethan walked straight to the reception desk and set the shadow box down with the deliberation of someone placing an artifact in a museum. "That's Captain Ashley Cooper," he announced. His voice was steady. It carried. "And you just fired her for saving someone's life the way she saved 19 SEALs in Sangin." The lobby froze. Sarah Kim, the head nurse from Ashley's unit, was standing 3 feet away. She picked up Ashley's personnel file, the one she'd reviewed 100 times, and her hand started shaking as she read the emergency contact information aloud. Military rank, Captain. Service number 3374219. Assignment date, Naval Special Warfare Command. Her voice cracked. Around her, staff members gathered. Whispers. Recognition. The calculations happening in real time as the invisible became visible. Commander James Rourke came down the stairwell from the ICU where he'd been maintaining vigil over Marcus. He came to attention with the precision of muscle memory, his presence filling the lobby the way a voice fills a canyon. "Captain Cooper holds the Navy Cross for maintaining a trauma bay alone for 6 hours under direct fire," he said. His words were deliberate, each one a formal charge. July 2019, Sangin Valley, Helmand Province. She sustained 2 Purple Hearts for combat injuries sustained while conducting medical evacuation under enemy contact. He turned to face the assembled staff. She's the medic who kept my entire platoon alive for 7 months when our supply lines were cut. Someone was selling our medical supplies to the black market. That someone was stealing from this hospital. 2 figures rose from the waiting area chairs, men in dark suits, the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. One held his credential case open like a priest displaying a gospel. "Special Agent Morrison, FBI," he said. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Dr. Robert Ashford, pending investigation into medical supply diversion, black market sales, and conspiracy to commit fraud involving federal military contracts." Dr. Ashford descended the main stairwell. He'd heard the commotion from his office. His face was the color of someone experiencing blood loss. "The evidence you constructed to justify Captain Cooper's termination," Agent Morrison continued, looking directly at Ashford, "provides the timeline we needed. You were on duty during every instance of supply disappearance. Your own documentation became our case." Security moved toward Ashford instead of toward Ashley. The hospital administrator appeared from a side corridor, his administrative instincts warring with the reality of federal agents in his lobby. Marcus wheeled himself from his room. He held the field journal, the one Ashley had given him in Sangin 3 years ago, with pressed desert flowers tucked between pages of what looked like personal notes but was actually coded intelligence. He held it up so everyone could see. "She sent me to gather this," Marcus said. His voice was stronger now, pain and medication and survival clearing his thoughts. "I documented every supply shortage that didn't make sense, every request that got denied. I got it performing the procedures she taught me because our medical supplies didn't match what we needed for that kind of trauma." He extended the journal toward Ashley. "She came here to finish what I couldn't." The lobby had become a courtroom. The evidence was physical and testimony was spoken in official voices. Dr. Ashford's hands trembled as security guided him toward the exit. He'd spent 6 weeks dismantling Ashley's credibility through institutional means, using protocol like a weapon, constructing documentation like a legal brief. He'd done it all so carefully, so thoroughly, so perfectly. And it had all just become his confession. Ashley stood motionless as the machinery of consequence moved around her. Her son was watching her. Commander Rourke was watching her. Sarah Kim was watching her with something like reverence on her face. The night shift staff who'd been instructed not to sit with her, not to speak with her, not to acknowledge her existence, they were watching too. She'd been invisible. Now she was impossible to ignore. 30 minutes after her firing, Ashley sits motionless in her car in the dim parking garage, engine dead, head pressed against the steering wheel. The fluorescent lights overhead buzz their mechanical complaint, casting everything in pale, sickly green. Her hands rest on her thighs, palms up, and she stares at them as if they belong to someone else, hands that have held lives together in sandstorm darkness, now useless. The mission is gone. Marcus will be transferred in hours. The intelligence journal stays locked in his room upstairs, and she cannot retrieve it without raising alerts that will scatter the entire operation across 3 continents. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is knowing that 17 operators downrange are without the surgical supplies Dr. Ashford diverted, that her SEAL teams in Helmand Province are operating with half the equipment they need, that people will die because she failed to stay invisible. The parking garage smells like motor oil and rain-soaked asphalt, and Ashley breathes it in like it might anchor her to something real. She presses her forehead harder against the steering wheel. She cannot move. She cannot call NCIS. She cannot admit who she really is because the moment she does, they'll pull her from the hospital entirely, and Marcus will be transferred before anyone can question why a classified journal ended up in his belongings. The car window raps. Sharp. Deliberate. Ashley's head snaps up. 17-year-old Ethan stands outside the glass with his backpack slung over one shoulder, and his face carries that exact stubborn set she recognizes from her own reflection, the expression that says someone has already decided something and made peace with the consequences. He points at the door. Ashley unlocks it. He slides into the passenger seat, and before she can speak, he pulls out a shadow box from his backpack. Inside, mounted on navy velvet, rest 3 medals, the Navy Cross with its distinctive blue ribbon, the Bronze Star with Valor device, and 2 Purple Hearts with their maroon silk bands catching the parking garage light like drops of blood. "They need to see these," Ethan says. His voice is steady. "Certain." "Ethan, no." But he's already moving, already closing the car door, already walking toward the hospital entrance with the shadow box held level like it's a priest carrying sacrament. Ashley moves on instinct, muscle memory that operates independent of judgment, and she's out of the car, moving fast, but Ethan is already inside the automatic doors. The lobby of Riverside Community Hospital transforms as he walks toward the reception desk. Staff members pause. The evening shift coordinator looks up from her computer. Ethan places the shadow box on the polished desk surface with ritual precision, and his voice carries clear across the marble, "That's Captain Ashley Cooper. You just fired her for saving someone's life the way she saved 19 SEALs in Sangin." Security moves immediately, 2 guards approaching from the north corridor, but they slow when they actually look at the medals. The Navy Cross doesn't lie. The Bronze Star with Valor doesn't lie. People who've worked at hospitals long enough know what those ribbons mean. The head nurse from Ashley's unit appears at the pharmacy window. She holds up her tablet and reads aloud from Marcus's file, her hands trembling. "Emergency contact listed as Naval Special Warfare Command, rank Captain, service number 0 for M2187. That's her. That's actually her." The hospital administrator emerges from her office, her face draining of color the way all institutional authority does when confronted with actual heroism. But the moment that changes everything, the moment the room realizes it has been standing next to a legend and treating her like a mistake, arrives with boots on tile. Commander Marcus Rourke descends the stairwell. Still in his Navy working uniform, still wearing the quiet authority of someone who commands Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, he comes down with 2 FBI agents flanking him like he personally authorized their existence. He walks directly to the shadow box and stands at attention in front of it, his posture the kind that makes everything else in the room look like slouching. His voice carries through the lobby like gravel being poured into a vault. "Captain Ashley Cooper holds the Navy Cross for maintaining a trauma bay alone for 6 hours under direct fire in Sangin. Bronze Star for 3 separate combat rescues in Helmand Province. 2 Purple Hearts. And she's the medic who kept my entire platoon alive for 7 months when our supply lines were cut. Do you understand? Our supply lines were cut. Because someone was selling our equipment to the enemy." He turns and looks directly at the administrative staff. His eyes are pale blue and absolutely without mercy. That someone worked in this building. The FBI agents move with the precision of a coordinated unit. They produce a warrant and seal Dr. Ashford's office with crime scene tape within 12 minutes, the white and red barrier going up like a quarantine sign. Over the next hour, federal agents emerge carrying bankers' boxes filled with files, each one labeled and logged. A staff member mentioned seeing surveillance footage in one of the agents' hands, Dr. Ashford at the medication supply room at 2:07 a.m. on June 14th. Then June 21st. Then July 3rd, 17 separate occasions across 6 months, each corresponding to the inventory discrepancies that left combat medics without pentothal, without saline, without the most basic equipment for stopping hemorrhage. The peer review committee he convened disbands when 3 members admit under federal questioning that Dr. Ashford specifically pressured them to support termination. One nurse says he told her directly, "You vote no, and I'll find discrepancies in your charting that will cost you your license." The threat is documented. It becomes evidence. It becomes part of the case against him that includes obstruction of military operations, black market trafficking, conspiracy to defraud, and theft of federal property valued at $2.3 million. By evening, federal charges are filed. Dr. Ashford is arrested in the parking garage by police officers with body cameras rolling, and the footage will play on the news cycle, the man who once ruled this hospital being escorted to a federal vehicle, his face the color of old bone, the careful construction of his authority collapsing into institutional custody. The hospital administrator calls an emergency staff meeting where she announces Dr. Ashford's termination and formally apologizes to Ashley, offering full reinstatement with back pay covering the hours she was unlawfully terminated. Her voice carries the peculiar thickness of someone who has just realized her hospital harbored a federal criminal. Ashley listens from the back of the auditorium, and when the administrator finishes and asks if Ashley has anything to say, Ashley simply shakes her head. "My work here is complete." Commander Rourke takes the podium afterward. He briefs the assembled staff with the precision of someone comfortable with classified information. The supply diversions Ashley tracked led to a network spanning 3 continents, black market sales that funded Taliban operations in Helmand and Nangarhar provinces, equipment theft that left 18 separate military units critically under-equipped during combat operations. The field journal documentation, combined with Ashley's intelligence gathering over 4 months of careful observation at Riverside Community Hospital, dismantled the entire operation. 23 arrests across the network. 14 countries involved in the investigation. What Captain Cooper did was remember, Rourke says, his voice steady as a metronome, is that being quiet doesn't mean being ineffective. Some of the most dangerous people I've ever known were the ones nobody noticed. They just worked. They just bled. They just held everything together while everyone else was looking somewhere else. In the chaos of aftermath, Ashley slips into Marcus's room on the 4th floor. He's sitting up now, stronger, his chest wrapped but healing, his eyes the color of slate and absolutely alert. When he sees her, something shifts in his face, recognition that goes deeper than identification. "You took the blast doing my job," Ashley says quietly. Marcus shakes his head. "The movement careful, measured. I took the blast doing our job. You taught me how to survive it." He reaches into his bedside drawer and withdraws the field journal, the leather worn soft from handling, from being carried in combat pack pockets across Helmand province, from being pressed against a heart that survived an IED blast partially because of training from the woman standing in front of him. Between the pages, pressed desert flowers rest intact, pale lavender blooms from the day Ashley left Sangin, the day Marcus decided to document her intelligence for the mission she was being reassigned to complete. He hands it to her with both hands, a gesture more ritual than practicality. "You need to take this home," he says. That evening, news crews begin arriving at the hospital. Satellite trucks from 3 local channels, reporters preparing their segments about federal investigation and medical fraud and Navy involvement. Ashley is already gone by then, already in her car heading home with a field journal locked in her glove compartment and 17 months of surveillance work finally complete. 18 months later, Ashley stands in the morning light outside Riverside Community Hospital wearing civilian clothes, and Marcus stands beside her in his Navy SEAL uniform, back on active duty, fully healed, the kind of recovered that nobody expected to witness when his chest was filling with blood. They've come back for a ceremony honoring the investigation's success, a medal presentation to FBI agents and hospital staff who cooperated with NCIS and federal prosecutors. As they walk through the lobby where Ethan revealed her identity, they pass a plaque now mounted on the east wall, commemorating the operation, Naval Investigative Services Task Force, May 18 to December 4, honoring those who served to protect military personnel. In the parking garage, checking badges at the night security entrance booth, they see Dr. Ashford. His uniform is gone. His credentials are gone. He checks automobile IDs for minimum wage in the building where he once commanded with casual cruelty, no longer trusted to touch patients, no longer trusted with anything except a scanner and a clipboard. He looks up as Ashley and Marcus approach, and his face is hollow, the kind of hollowed out that comes from understanding that everything you built was actually nothing, that the people you tried to destroy were the ones holding you accountable. Ashley doesn't break stride. In the hospital auditorium, Commander Rourke takes the podium. The auditorium is packed with federal investigators, hospital administrators, Navy leadership. He speaks with the particular authority of someone who has seen actual combat and knows exactly what supplies mean on a battlefield. Supply theft doesn't just create inventory discrepancies. It kills operators. Captain Cooper's mission recovered medical equipment valued at $2.3 million and identified supply line vulnerabilities that have since been secured across 17 international installations. Her work saved lives we'll never know to count. The room stands in applause. Ethan sits in the third row, watching his mother receive recognition for the kind of service that asks for silence and delivers justice anyway. Afterward, outside in the Atlanta morning light, the kind of clear, bright day that makes everything feel newly possible, Ashley pins her son's Junior ROTC Achievement Medal on his uniform. Ethan will be joining the Naval Academy next fall, for years of training before he becomes what she already is, someone who holds it all together when it matters most. Marcus stands beside them in his SEAL uniform, 3 generations of service converging in one moment beneath the Atlanta sky. Marcus hands Ashley the field journal with both hands again, a ritual repeated, a circle completed. These flowers are from the day you left Sangin. I pressed them because you said something about remembering why we do impossible things. Ashley runs her fingers over the dried petals, faded lavender against cream-colored pages filled with coded intelligence that dismantled an entire network. Her voice is steady, the voice of someone who has learned that composure isn't absence of fear, it's clarity about what matters. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. That's the real strength. That's the real power. They walk toward the parking garage where her car once sat dead, where her son found her at her lowest point and changed everything by refusing to let her remain invisible. Behind them, the hospital stands unchanged, its windows reflecting Atlanta morning light, its corridors still carrying the careful competence of people learning to trust what they actually see instead of what they assume. If you've ever been judged without being known, if you've ever held it together when no one was watching, if you've ever remembered why impossible things matter, share Captain Ashley Cooper's story. Subscribe for more videos about the quiet heroes who change everything. Like this if you believe the strongest people are often the ones nobody notices. And comment who in your life is the quiet one holding it all together.